Well, hi everybody. My name is Frank Leone, and I've had the both the pleasure and the adventure of being Ryan Leone's father for the last 34 years and 3 months. And I might look a little older than I am, given everything I've been through all these years, but I'm actually only 41 years old, so I'm still a midlife person and have the energy to back it up. But in any event, I wanted to share some thoughts about Ryan's life from my perspective, from a parent's perspective. I think it could be very instructive because when you go through some of the challenges Ryan has gone through, as well as some of the successes and joys, it really does have an impact on a parent. And I think it's important for those that are interested in Ryan's work to have an idea of what various addiction issues and so forth can also do to a family unit. So I wanted to go in that direction. But first, let's go back to the very beginning. August 3rd, 1985. I was there, 5:02 p.m. in the afternoon in Framingham, Massachusetts, outside Boston. And Ryan was born at that time and lived for the first 3.5 years in Massachusetts before we all came out here to Santa Barbara and have been here ever since. What was Ryan like as a young child? Well, he was good. He was, first of all, a very, very handsome, attractive young child, the kind of child that we would bring into a public place and people would immediately gravitate toward him. Very, very calm and comfortable in his early years. Didn't cause any problems, didn't cry very much, virtually didn't cry at all. Slept through the night. I think my wife has told me in a matter of a week or so after he came home from the hospital. So he was extraordinary in that regard as well. Learned a couple things early on, though, which looking back now were very predictive of the kind of things that he would ultimately be doing professionally. He was always very creative. We took him to his first movie. It was, for the record, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He was about 3 years old when we took him to that, and then right after that, a few weeks later, we saw Working Girl, a little bit of a more mature movie. But right from the start, Ryan always had an extraordinary interest in films, an extraordinary understanding. And we started really recognizing that there's some degree of genius there when his favorite early movie was Ghostbusters, and that was 3.5, 4 years old, so very, very early in his life. And he was literally quoting Long Passengers verbatim, word for word, from that movie, which was almost a sign of genius to me. I couldn't understand then what was going on, but it was just this, I think everybody, all of us, have a genius in some manner, have it in ourselves, and I think that was the genius in Ryan that we found, this creativity, this appreciation of storytelling and putting stories together and so forth. So that's what he was like as a young child, and he went through grade school and junior high and so forth out here in Santa Barbara. In junior high, we sent him to a very good private school called Marymount, and it was a challenge for Ryan because a lot of the kids had already been there since kindergarten and came from affluent families that put a lot of money into their child's educations. But Ryan got through it well. But we started also seeing some early signs of issues that were cropping up then. He seemed to have an inclination to partying, if you will. Before most of his other male peers, I remember he had a girlfriend as early as 7th grade, I think, which was pretty early. I certainly didn't when I was in 7th grade. And so we started to get a sense of what Ryan was all about, but again, you don't predict those things. So then in the fall of 2000 is when Ryan entered high school. And there's not a lot of private school options here in Santa Barbara, but the public schools are pretty good. So he went to Santa Barbara High, which is this iconic, one of the oldest high schools, one of the oldest high school structures in the state of California. He went there with a lot of his Marymount friends. Initially, one of the reasons that he went was that he wanted to play football. Ryan was always good at sports that involved, strength and intensity, and less interested in sports that required finesse, like baseball or basketball or golf or tennis. But things like soccer or football, he was strong at because he had a good motor and he had a lot of spirit in him when he got out there on the playing field. So that's what led him to Santa Barbara High. And the way things work is that the summer before your freshman year, if you were planning to play freshman football, as Ryan did, and for the record, Ryan was of all things a center, hiking the ball back to the quarterback, that summer you actually take as a credit course football. And Ryan went every morning to Santa Barbara High to learn football, if you will, and actually went on a road trip the first game of the year down to a school called Long Beach Poly, which has a long history of producing Division I college football players and a lot of players that have since gone on to the NFL. And here's Ryan and a bunch of other freshmen on a bus going down to Long Beach to play Long Beach Poly. But that's when things started, and that's when some things started really going wrong right away at the beginning of the freshman year, or even the summer before the freshman year. We really didn't know. We got little hints. Sometimes he would come back much later than he was supposed to. Sometimes he wouldn't come back at all and would call and tell us that he was staying at a friend's house, and he had done that in the past, so we were okay with that. And when he went to Santa Barbara High, I guess like any parent, we have pretty significant expectations. We see mostly the good, very little of the bad. And my impression going in when Ryan was going to start high school was, is he going to be a great student, because he was very smart. He started in a couple of what they call out here GATE classes, or advanced placement classes. Was he going to be very popular? He was always very popular in junior high right before that. He seemed very comfortable with both males and females. Or was he going to be this great football player that I envisioned, since I was always so interested in sports myself, and I played football in high school as well. So going in, I had these wonderful expectations. He's going to be at least one of those three, if not two, if not all three. And things, unfortunately, broke down quickly, although you never know. Sometimes in life when things break down, there's a reason for it, and in the long term, it turns out for the best. But in any event, we started seeing things starting to go astray that summer a little bit. He started hanging out with some older kids, and I think part of it was that he was a pretty cool guy for a guy entering ninth grade, so the 11th and 12th graders were pretty accepting of him. And of course, he found his ways to a lot of high school parties, even though he was just turning 15 then. And a lot, as one might expect in those high school parties, there's an abundance of drugs and alcohol and other problems that might be there. So he got introduced fairly early, and that's probably what got things started for Ryan at that point. The first thing that I really remember that happened that indicated that we might be off to some rough sledding here occurred about a week after school officially began in September of 2000. And as many people know, most schools, most high schools, have back-to-school nights for the parents, especially those of ninth graders that are just entering the school for the first time. And Santa Barbara High had such an event, and my wife Diane and I went to it. Ryan was home, and we had two cars. She drove one, I drove one. And the one that we left at home was a Volvo. It was an old Volvo, 1987, 1989, somewhere in there. And when we got back, Ryan immediately ran out and met us as we pulled into the garage and said, "Oh, I got to tell you what happened. I was sitting in the house and I heard this giant bang outside, and I looked outside and some car had backed into the Volvo from the street and then sped off and left before Ryan could get a license number or anything like that." So we went out and looked at the Volvo, and sure enough, the back was severely damaged, which is pretty remarkable because Volvos are like tanks in the U.S. Army or the Marines or something. But it was pretty well banged up. And being a parent that tends to want to believe your child, at least initially, I assume that that's what Ryan told us is exactly what happened. So we called the police in order to file a report, leaving the car where it was, so that perhaps insurance could cover correcting the damages on the car. And the police came out and they looked at it and asked a couple questions. And then the police officer from the Santa Barbara Police Department suggested something to me. He said, go in the car, turn on the radio, and see what channel is on that radio. So I went in and I turned on the radio, and unlike what I would have, which might have been talk radio, or it might have been 1960s music, or it might have been classical music, it was rap music. And I can promise you that my eclectic interest in all sorts of music does not extend to rap music. So I went and told the police officer, well, there's a station there that I don't recognize that happens to be the last station that was on the car radio. And it was playing rap music. So the officer just sort of smiled at me and said, well, I think we know what happened, that car somehow found its way out in the neighborhood and something happened. And I believe Ryan fessed up pretty quickly once we identified what had happened and told him about it. And apparently he was with another friend that got in more trouble than Ryan during those years. And apparently they backed it up somewhere and didn't notice there was either a tree or a telephone pole or something right behind it, and damaged it pretty well. So that was the first little hint that we had that things were potentially not going to be as smooth as I thought they were going to be that freshman year in high school. Just a couple weeks later, and I can actually remember the date, it was October 7th of the year 2000, I was working. I had my own company that I ran for 31 years and had an office in downtown Santa Barbara, and came home at the usual hour, 5 or 5:30. It was a Friday, and I was speaking the next day. I do a lot of public speaking, or I did, certainly. And that Saturday morning, I was speaking at a big conference. I'm in healthcare. I was in healthcare then as well, and a big conference in Oakland. So a plane ride from Santa Barbara up to San Francisco, and then a rental car over to the East Bay. So I came home to pack my bags, and Ryan was here with somebody that he knew. They actually had been on the same soccer team a couple years earlier, and now they were classmates at Santa Barbara High. And I don't want to mention any names, but his father was a very prominent person in law enforcement here in Santa Barbara. And he was a twin. He had a twin brother. Just one of the twins was here that night. So I said hello to this young man and packed my bags and headed off to the airport. And Diane, Ryan's mom, came back shortly thereafter. She owned a retail store in downtown. So she worked until 5:30 or 6 every night during those days. And I flew up to San Francisco and went into my hotel room in the East Bay and went to bed because I had to speak the next morning before several hundred people, and I wanted to get a good night's sleep. That was important to me. About 11:30 at night, I get a phone call from my wife, who's panic-stricken, and said that Ryan's hallucinating, that he's apparently on some sort of drugs, that he was across the street in somebody's backyard, not dealing with things very realistically, and that he was home and she simply didn't know what to do. And there I am lying in bed. I'd already turned off the lights. It's about 11:30 at night on Friday night. I had to speak at this breakfast symposium the next morning about 8:30. And I said, well, I don't know what to do. Why don't you try to get some medical help to come by? Because I don't know what hallucinating means. I mean, is it potentially near death? Is it something temporary? Is it something that's going to get deeper? We had to do something here. So as I remember, and of course this is 19 years ago now, somebody came to the house, evaluated Ryan, and let us know that it's probably not potentially fatal. But it turned out that Ryan was starting to experiment with over-the-counter drugs, and I believe this was a drug called Marazine. I may be wrong, which is an anti-seasickness or an anti-motion sickness medication that you can take, you can take extra dosages of it, and it can really affect you. He was also doing Quercetin at the time, which at the time was also, if you take it in excess, something that could cause you to experience certain highs. Didn't know it at the time, but Ryan had also been dealing with other drugs, marijuana certainly, and perhaps some of the other lighter drugs that might have been out there. But it was obviously a concern, and this was 11:30, and I probably didn't get to sleep till 2 or 2:30, and even then didn't sleep well, wondering what was going to happen to Ryan, and realizing that my wife was by herself and had to deal with this on her own if something got worse. And so forth. So I got up very early the next morning, called my wife again, checked on it. He was sleeping. He was apparently okay. Went and did my talk on very, very little sleep. Got through it. But it was the first time that drugs or alcohol had really jumped into our lives from Ryan's usage of it. And it was only going to get worse in the very, very near future after that. But that was in early October, October 7th. I believe my presentation was October the 7th, the day I traveled up there. May have been that date. But that was the first time that we actually saw this. Then a couple weeks later, maybe just 10 days later or so, my wife and I were in Boston. My company did these big national conferences. We probably had about 400 or 500 people at that conference in Boston in the year 2000. And we were there. We were there from Wednesday or Thursday of one week till about Wednesday the next week. Arranged for Ryan to stay somewhere else, put alarms on in the house so he couldn't get in the house, and he was able to get to school and so forth during that period. And so we were out that Saturday night with other people that worked for my company, and came back, and there I was. I got to throw this in somewhere, an avid fan of the New York Mets. I'm a native New Yorker, and the Mets, lo and behold, were playing in the World Series, and lo and behold, number 2 were playing the hated rival New York Yankees in that World Series, and that Saturday night was game number 1. So we ran back to the hotel room, we're watching the game, and I get this voicemail message that from some random person in Santa Barbara that I didn't know, and it was an FYI kind of thing. I'm calling to just give you a heads up that our son or daughter, I forget which it was, told us that Ryan Leone is having a big blowout party at your house tonight, and that really everybody's invited to it. Anybody in high school is invited to it, and you should just know that. And he didn't know that we were away in Boston. He just knew that this 9th grader was throwing this big giant party, which inevitably was going to have controlled substances available to everybody, including young people, 15, 16 years old, or even younger than that, perhaps. So all we could do was call the neighbor that lives across the street and ask if she saw anything going on. She says, yes, it's really getting crazy around here. There's all sorts of cars, et cetera, et cetera. So my understanding, again, we're 3,000 miles away, and there's nothing more frustrating than being so far away when trouble is brewing. And it was the harbinger of many, many more instances like this to come over the years, where traveling so much professionally like I did, I was often away and couldn't do things about it when problems were occurring at home. But it turned out that our neighbor apparently spent a good part of the next hour or so out in the streets sort of flagging cars to go away, no party, no party. But that was, again, a very telling sign of where things were going. And I might add, it's something that I would have probably done myself some years earlier when I was that age, so I could understand it. But on the other hand, it indicated a certain degree of wildness that was going on. So in any event, all this was going on, and then we started getting messages from the school. And there was an automated system that basically said that your son, Ryan Leone, missed 1 or more classes at Santa Barbara High today. And we started getting those every day. And we kept on speaking to Ryan about it, and at first there was denial that it really didn't happen. And it's a remarkable thing for any other parents or soon-to-be parents that are watching this. Denial is an incredible effect that you can have when you have a child and you really love that child. And by and large, even though deep down inside I knew there were issues that were emerging, there was an awful lot of denial that I was carrying with me, that there really wasn't as big a problem as I thought there might be. But we kept on getting those messages. We also found out the coach of the football team called me personally and told me that Ryan hadn't shown up for football practice in weeks. And I didn't know this. According to Ryan, he was at football practice every day. So Ryan was off the team, and the coach didn't want him to be off the team and said, I'll give him a chance if he wants to come back to the team. But Ryan wasn't interested in that. But it turned out that Ryan was not going to very many classes, if any, during that period. Santa Barbara High was an open campus where you can go into campus and then you can leave anytime you want during the school day, et cetera, et cetera. Presumably Ryan found other like-minded classmates there that also did the same thing, and by and large that's what he was doing as he entered high school, not paying very much attention to high school. So we really had to deal with this in one way or another, and this was basically the first intervention that that we made as a parent, and decided to move him out of Santa Barbara High, and move him to a private school about 50 miles from Santa Barbara, way up in the Santa Ynez Hills Valley, right near where, of all people, Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch was, and up in basically Santa Barbara County wine country. So it was an isolated place. He couldn't get in much trouble. He really couldn't walk away and go very far. So indeed, we were able to get Ryan admitted there. It helped that he came from a prestigious private junior high school that wrote him excellent letters of recommendation. And Ryan went to the school. His name, for the moment, escapes me, but he went there, and he was there for a matter of 4 or 5 days. And again, here I am out of town again. I'm up in Portland, Oregon. And this was the very, very early days of cell phones, but I had a cell phone with me out at a restaurant at a business meeting with a client in Portland, Oregon. And I get a phone call about 8 o'clock at night, 8:30 at night, from the headmaster of that school saying, listen, Ryan doesn't want to stay here, and we can't make him stay here if he doesn't want to stay here. So I'm saying, well, we just pulled him out of Santa Barbara High, and now he's at this private school, this private high school, and now he wants to leave, and I already paid for the full semester, even though he came in mid-semester, and so forth and so on. So I said, well, let's sit on it for a day or two and see what happens. So it turned out I get a phone call the next day, and Ryan had somehow commandeered a bicycle and got on the bicycle and started trying to drive back to Santa Barbara, 50 miles away. And this is on something called the San Marcos Pass, which is a very dangerous street for vehicles, motor vehicles, no less, bicycles. So it became pretty clear to us that Ryan and this private school weren't going to work. So we didn't know what to do. I mean, here you have this just turned 15-year-old freshman in high school with all the potential in the world that has no school to go to. He's not going to go back to Santa Barbara High. We just pulled him out. He's not going to go to this private school because they're basically throwing him out, but he doesn't want to be there anyway. So the only alternative we had was a Catholic school here in Santa Barbara, a private Catholic school named Bishop Diego. And so we had to get Ryan admitted there, which was a little bit tricky because he had this track record now of 2 schools he didn't make it at. So he got an interview there, and they had to interview him before they could accept him, and that was like at 1 o'clock in the afternoon one day. So I went out and found a sub sandwich for him, came back, and came into his room to give him the sandwich so he'd have protein in him and have a full stomach by the time he went to the interview. And I walk into his bedroom, and sure enough, he's there smoking marijuana, which is not the worst thing he could do, but not a good thing to do before you go on a interview for a high school. So I didn't have much of a choice. He had to come I brought him over there, stoned though he may be, for his interview, and he somehow got through it. And I think to me, the most telling question was, they said, well, it says here on the application that you play football. And Ryan says, yeah, and he talked a little bit about playing football, and a small private school like that is looking for any willing body to join their football team. It's an important thing. So that probably pushed the envelope in Ryan's favor, and he joined the team, and he joined the school, and that lasted only about a week or two. And they found one day he was in class and he had marijuana on him, and somehow they found that out. I think he even bragged about it and told people about it, and he got immediately expelled. And I remember I was in town when that happened, but I had to drive over to the school and pick him up, bring him out to the car, and I did try to state my case that, give him one more chance and all that, and still somewhat in denial about what the issues were. they wouldn't do it. So he and I walked out to the parking lot, and I remember very clearly that somebody saw me in the parking lot and asked me what was wrong with me. And apparently I had a very, very sad, long look on my face, which is unusual. I'm usually a pretty upbeat, happy guy, but that was like the third strike that had happened in a matter of a couple of weeks. And I was really upset by it a lot. And it was really affecting Ryan's mom, who's just a wonderful, wonderful lady herself. It's our only child, and that made it even a little bit more challenging for us. So to sort of wrap up this session then, what could we do at this point? Well, it was almost Christmas time by now, and I wandered back to Santa Barbara High, and I pleaded with them to take Ryan back. And it is a public school, so they did take Ryan back, and Ryan re-entered Santa Barbara High just before Christmas, and then Christmas break came along, and a new year 2001 was about to begin. And that's the first chapter, and the next chapter will be what happens after the beginning of the year, and some very monumental changes in Ryan's life at that point. So signing off for now, it's Frank Leone, Ryan's dad, and I'm happy I could share some time with you. Thanks.
Palabra.